I'm Robert Fenner.
And I'm Alvin Chua.
And today we are talking about the Assault Suit series by NCS Messiah and their legacy and their impact on the mecha platformer genre.
Basically I've been thinking a lot about 2D, like mainly 16-bit mecha platformers and how those games sort of work. What is it in those particular games that conveys, well, their genre?
Maybe to give some back history on the mecha platformer genre, we can look at some of the games that were available before Messiah decided to put their own spin on things. With a lot of the earlier titles, the mecha character or the mecha player character was really just window dressing. And the character sprite just happened to be a robot. It could have been anything. It could have been a human or a weird creature. I mean, we can compare.
I mean, Contra, like for instance, in Europe was Pro Protector, where they had these Pat Labor-esque robots as stand-ins for the Rambo and Arnie type characters, and it made absolutely no difference to the gameplay. In fact, I kind of preferred those sprites to the US and Japanese versions just because I liked mecha a lot, and then felt kind of like weirdly conned into liking those games for something that the original designers never intended.
Right.
So there is that aspect, and then you realize sort of like, what is it that represents the mecha genre in these games? And I think it was only from Messiah. Well, in my experience anyway. It was only in the Messiah games where I started to get a sense of a game that actually tried to recreate the experience of a mecha anime and being in control of some kind of hulking mech. And Final Zone was one of the first games where there was a bit of that, but like you say, it was a lot more about having a cool, boxy, isometric sprite in the middle of your screen that felt like it had this presence of something that suggested you were in control of this kind of like mobile tank thing, but the gameplay wasn't really there.
Yeah, the mech in Final Zone was extremely agile. You could just spin around and run around the battlefield on a dime. And I was thinking about some earlier shooters as well, like Sega's Transbot, and comparing that to other space shooters like Forgotten Worlds by Capcom, where you're just a man floating in space. Really, the games just play the same, and there's no weightiness to the character movement. Whereas in Messiah's games, you really have a feel for controlling a big hunk of steel.
Oh, indeed. I mean, another really early Capcom shooter, Sidearms, which I was sadly swindled into loving because it featured a transforming mech and some very, very cool sort of like cabinet and flyer art. I recall. Was just a very, very fast-paced, quite enjoyable side-scrolling shooter, but nothing really to do with, again, the whole mecha sci-fi genre stuff.
Right, yeah.
And I think a good point of comparison is if you look at, basically, how mecha anime progressed from where it was up to the point of Gundam and other, even more militarized stuff like Macross, where you had the super robot genre, where they were basically superheroes.
Yeah, Mazinger Z and Gigantor and all those pre-Gundam robots were, they were basically superheroes. They could fly around and do anything. You weren't really encouraged to think too much about the story. Those sorts of stories, they were a very black and white, good versus evil. But when with Tomino's Gundam in 1979, not only did the genre shift to hard SF. And really get into the nuts and bolts of how to make a mech suit believable. It also ruminated quite a bit on war, and there was a lot more nuance and gray area rather than the black and white of what came before it.
And I think the Messiah games definitely started to delve into that. I mean, like only very vaguely, but there is the element, even in Assault Suits Leynos, the first game that we're going to talk about, there's that sort of sense of well, I mean, I guess it never really gets beyond. Isn't war a bit harsh and possibly a futile endeavor? But as we'll later see in Assault Suits Valken, Cybernator, there's again they add a little bit more texture to that experience, even if it is like mostly just lifted directly from Gundam.
Yeah, all of these games are the Messiah Assault Suit games. They're all very much Gundam. It's a battle between an Earth Federation and a space colony, or some derivative within. I think a few of the games tackle resource wars and taking over territories. So it's not battling a evil crushing alien threat. It's slightly more nuanced than that, but within the platformer genre, you can't expect something extremely deep.
No, true. Well, let's look at Assault Suit Leynos then. Target Earth.
Okay. I think you're a lot more familiar with this game than I am. I only played it for the first time very recently. I remember it being around under the name Target Earth when I was a kid, but I really didn't like the box art, and that put me off from renting it. Just quite a shallow thing.
Well, I think I can one-up you there in that I liked it because it had the word assault suit in the title. So
I didn't get that pleasure in America. It was this very sort of 90s yellow extreme font and a very sort of anatomically correct looking robot floating in space.
Right, yeah. And I guess it sounds a bit like a Ron Hubbard novel. Is that a Ron Hubbard novel title?
It probably is. I'm not certain.
It's the Scientology and mecha platformer.
Yeah.
But,
so the story in Target Earth is a team that was set into space years prior have come back, and for some reason they hate Earth and they want to blow it up. And you take the role of a man named Rex, who is part of the Earth Federation, and you jump around in your robot in an attempt to quell this interplanetary threat. Now, this game is extremely difficult. We can see the start of Messiah's devotion to making a weightier and more authentic feel when it comes to controlling your mech suit. But I felt the controls were a little bit tough to manage,
especially before you get the jump pack.
Absolutely, but I found it very, very difficult to avoid damage.
Absolutely, it is incredibly difficult to avoid damage.
It's quite difficult to aim, and it seems like everything can just all of your enemies can just lock onto you instantly.
I mean, I can't necessarily argue that makes anything about any of those aspects making the game more fun to play or easier to play for someone who would have just picked it up. But my experience of it and what I wanted out of it, I guess, again, it's just a very personal thing, for it to represent the whole idea of being a military mech pilot in like something out of a mecha anime, was that the weapon choices seemed like, for instance, having to choose your loadout between missions.
Yeah,
that it added to this air of a military sort of. You were going on these military operations. You could see your forces fighting the enemy forces in the backgrounds, or in fact directly on the levels you were fighting on.
Yeah, I think in the first stage you start out on a base with your comrades, and you're trying to defend your base, and they're helping you out to a limited degree of success. Seeing your battle comrades and picking your loadout was sort of a level of depth that you didn't really see in platformers in 1991.
And again, things like the limited arc of a lot of the weapons meant you had to very specifically pick what you were going to use against the enemies you were going to face on a particular stage. Unfortunately, that also meant that if you'd never played that stage before, you were probably going to die embarrassingly. But
I believe there are no continues at first.
There is that as well. So when you get further into the game and face an enemy that you're not quite sure what you're going to require to fight, you're probably going to lose and then have to start again.
I understand if a couple of levels in, there's a sort of a secret and non-intuitive way to get continues, a limited amount. I wasn't able to figure out how to do that. I found it to be extremely hostile. And I think the developers may have known exactly how hostile it was, because just by pressing start on the second controller gives you infinite life.
Yeah, that's most of my experience with the game. Admittedly, it was from playing it with that cheat enabled. And I think I got a lot out of what they seem to be intending to do with that game, more than what the game actually did. The execution's a little bit sort of failing there, but
I think it had a lot of potential, and it did a lot of interesting things. But I felt that I agree in terms of execution. There was quite a bit to be desired. Gee, what more can we say about Leynos?
I guess unfortunately, in a lot of other ways, it falls into a lot of the tropes of the genre at that time. There's like enemy battleship thing.
Halfway through the game, you meet the rival commander Rance, who he has his little plot speech where he explains his motivations. Where he was the leader of a team that was sent into space 100 years prior. And they ran into quote unquote trouble and radioed into Earth for help and were refused. So somehow, and I think he explains it through organ transplants, they've stayed alive in space for 100 years, waiting to make their revenge. And so it's a sort of
allegory for British colonialism. War is hell, and space war is space hell.
There is a very, very small shade of gray where I believe the main character Rex tries to talk Rance out of his war on Earth. And he says, "Oh, I can't. I've just gone too far now," and ends up blowing up in an explosion of glory.
I seem to recall that. I think Rex takes the opinion that it's okay to be that angry, but maybe not that angry. So Leynos has art by Satoshi Urushihara, who did a lot of character art for many of Messiah's games. And in fact, Rance shows up in Langrisser, Warsong on Genesis, reprising his role as a evil enemy commander, but in a sort of medieval fantasy setting. For
neat.
For Genesis games of the time, the character portraits were one of the highlights of Target Earth. I think
they're pretty small, but there is an unmistakable style there.
I mean, again, in 1990, the fact that they were adding that level of character and all these sort of like radio communication between yourself just sort of added a sense of atmosphere. That was something that was coming into its own in that period. I think when the very idea of cutscenes was really quite new and hadn't been explored that much. Was that same year as Ninja Gaiden?
It might have been after.
Okay,
maybe I'm mistaken.
I forget Ninja Gaiden. Ninja Gaiden was late 80s, wasn't it? And this is
I think that was 80s.
Yeah,
but that was sort of the first of its kind in terms of cinematic cutscenes for an 8 or 16-bit game.
But I think the thing with Target Earth was that Salt Suit Leynos was that it was very much one of those, again of its time, games where each level presented a very specific puzzle in terms of like exactly what you needed to approach it with in terms of your weapon loadout, and you just fail and be punished otherwise. And that's really not something that's like commendable these days or easy to go back to. So I mean that's one of the biggest flaws there, really.
I was punished quite severely in the fourth stage, which is I think it's the first base siege in the game where you fight through the jungle and then jump down a hatch and navigate this fortress. And while you're descending through the various floors of this fortress, you're offered a choice of falling to the left or falling to the right. And if you fall to the left, you fall into a laser trap that you can't get out of. And if you're playing the invincibility cheat like I was, that meant resetting the entire game.
Well, you could say that's just punishment for violating the rules of the game. But no, that's,
I suppose.
Yeah.
I think like at least a way to get out of it would have been appreciated.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely the sort of mistake that Leynos makes fairly often.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, Leynos, cool ideas. How well it stands up today, personally, I don't think very well.
No. I mean, you're absolutely right there. I think it's a good marker point for the genre, sort of like beginning to attempt to have that militarized sci-fi feel. So, not successfully, but you can see their intentions. Again, things like I said, like the weapon loadouts, the atmosphere, war is hell, all of that stuff hadn't been brought into sci-fi shooters quite in that way. And another point that the difficulty of control, which is something I think is expressed in various ways in other games in the genre, is I feel also an aspect of these games where the idea that you're mastering a vehicle is, the sense that you're this complicated machine that you're in control of is part of the experience. And there's a line to be drawn in terms of making it too difficult to the point where it just confounds the player, but making it just difficult enough so that mastering it gives you that sense of, ooh, I'm the pilot of this space robot. So yes, I think that's I'd like to say I hope that some of their intention to begin with, and we definitely see that sort of feel better realized in the later games, like Assault Suit Valken, for instance.
Yes, Assault Suit Valken, or Cybernator, as it was called in the West, the second Assault Suits game out of Messiah. This time changing platform to the Super Nintendo in 1992. Valken was directed by Hideo Suzuki, who was a programmer on Leynos, and I think it's here that we really see the series start to come into its own.
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of, in all the terms that we spoke of Leynos, Assault Suits Valken pretty much nails it almost, I feel. I mean, even possibly in comparison to the games that followed it to some degree. I mean, well, arguably, we'll get to another game that does, I feel, move the genre forward a bit in some ways. But everything that you needed, the sense of weightiness that complicates the controls somewhat, is there, but it's not unmanageable. You have things like the boost, which you've got right from the start, which makes, despite the fact that you're controlling this heavy machine, you've still got some sort of sense of being able to move quickly when you need to, but you can't, it's still a bit of a decision you've got to make. It's situational. That creates a sense of, involvement again with the mechanics of the different weapons are again, like, they're based on military things. There's the napalm, of course.
Lovely.
And, yes. Which is secret, so I guess, Geneva Conventions have some effect. But
our secret war crimes.
Yes, absolutely.
In space.
But also lifts incredibly heavily from Gundam, in taking entire scenes, like verbatim almost, from Gundam, but in a way that at the time, because no one else was doing it, didn't seem like a ripoff, but just felt like, oh, we're finally seeing these ideas realized in another medium, which was really at the time.
I think the plot here, it's basically just the same as the first Gundam series. There's a war between the Space Axis and the Federation for territory on the moon. Yeah, and you control Jake Brain. Oh yes, young pilot,
Mr. Brain.
With his he's taking orders and he's making a name for himself. And he's just a soldier. He's no hero. Jake Brain goes into battle. He's got his teammates who there's the stoic one, the nerdy one with the glasses, and the lovely female operator who wants him to come back safely.
Oh, you know, she happens to care for him.
Yeah.
You know? And again, nice represented by some pretty nice character art.
Yeah, once again, Urushihara is doing the character portraits here, but they're much larger and much more colorful and recognizable. I really feel like Valken improves on Leynos in every way, from its visual presentation to its controls, which are easy to learn and difficult to master.
Yeah, I mean, again, weapon choice is important, but there's flexibility. There's a reloading mechanic, which seems unwieldy compared to something like Contra, but again, adds to the feel that it's a military.
There's a sort of strategy to it.
Absolutely. The weapon, again, the use of the weapons is helped incredibly, I feel, by the sound. I mean, the Super Nintendo sound chip does these things brilliantly. And lots of metal on metal sound effects. Like when you're deploying a shield, you can hear these like kind of clanking effects. Just walking around heavily.
Yeah.
There's a ton of that. The music as well. I mean, it's
the music's fantastic. One thing I noticed about Valken's music was that it reminded me a lot of the music from the RPG Brainlord. And in fact, the two games share a composer in Masanao Akahori. And I think this is probably one of his strongest soundtracks. He hasn't done very much, but I mean, he's always recognizable whenever he takes to the Super Nintendo stage.
I haven't played Brainlord, but I mean, some of the
great soundtrack above anything else in that game.
Right. I mean, the strength of the soundtrack definitely is the militaristic, sort of like lots of metallic percussion, but not metallic in the overly tinny sort of Genesis stroke Mega Drive kind of way.
Yeah, it's not farty.
No, not at all. But that's just lots of tiny detail, the backgrounds, and the fact that you can see the sense of scale you get with your mecha versus the little tiny infantry you'll see running out, and then you can in fact yourself get out of your mecha at some points.
Yeah.
And again, that's
the sprites are much bigger, and everything's just it seems so much clearer.
I think they really made a good use of their sort of like pixel real estate that they had there. Even one could say I feel like a bit better than again the games that follow in the modern era, which recreate the pixel style to some degree, but I don't feel anyone's really pulled it off to the extent that they did in Valken. But there's again more Gundam stuff in there. Like they try and drop an asteroid on Earth at one point, I believe.
Oh, they do. Is it a colony? Are they dropping?
Oh, it's a colony on an asteroid. Again,
it's always a colony.
It's a colony, but again lifted straight from Gundam.
Yeah.
And there's of course the recurring enemy character, which you have, and variety of mechanics in the levels. There's a asteroid field sequence where you
plays a bit like a side-scrolling shooter.
But again, with a bit more of a sense of gravity. There's this sort of you punch asteroids, and just the weight of your interaction with the other enemy and obstacle sprites.
Yeah,
adds to that.
You fly through the asteroid field from left to right, and eventually you end up in a zero gravity base, which you have to navigate. It's not quite a maze, but it's very, very tall from top to bottom, and you fly around in every direction trying to get to the end and avoiding traps.
But some of those levels are actually rather sort of like, well, not quite maze-like, but at least they have a sense of exploring.
They're very big, and you are shown a map when you pause, just showing how much real estate is devoted to these stages. It's interesting. Some of them you can make your way through in a more non-linear fashion. There's higher paths and lower paths, each with their own power-ups and secrets and enemies. It's a hell of a lot of fun to play. Oh
yeah, absolutely. Even to this day, again, I mean, it's just the right combination again of atmosphere and mechanics, all sort of like working to create that sort of that sense of piloting a giant mech in a 2D sort of environment, which is actually quite a difficult thing to pull off if you think about it. But I think that they definitely succeeded.
Valken's US release was privy to some censorship of some certain scenes,
Yeah,
one in particular.
And it's not the opening scene where the phallic spaceship crashes through the wall of the space colony. There's a the president, I believe, of is it the Axis?
I think so.
Standing that commits suicide in front of you. He shoots himself in the head. And even though it's a tiny sprite, it's quite. I think there was even some question as to whether that would make it into the Japanese version.
Yeah, there is an interesting interview with the team at gosokyu.com. It's GOSOKKYU.com, talking about the process that went into Valken and cut content and the challenges that they faced. And there's a bit where they talked about how it was a really gutsy move to submit the game to the publisher with the suicide scene, but they really wanted it to be in there.
But it's definitely something again that adds to that feel of that mecha anime like Gundam had at the time, with that sort of people being driven to moral extremes and the reaction to that. So I think it was like faithful again. Even today that seems like a little sort of a bit of an attempt to push the envelope for no real reason. But at that time they were just trying to bring what were tropes of popular genre into the console medium, and it definitely worked.
It definitely worked.
So it worked better than the PS2 port of Assault Suit Valken, which is infrequently found in UK and European supermarkets. Well, not anymore, but it was for a while.
Yes, this is one of those, Simple 2000 or D3 sort of budget remakes of a 16-bit title, and it shows.
It's terrible. It's something that you should not play if you like or enjoy. Well, you should really. It's highly unlikely you'll get any enjoyment out of it, and it does nothing but misrepresent the original game. Sadly, it's
easy to see how much love and craftsmanship went into Valken, and just how the PS2 up-res port was just slapdash together.
Oh yeah, I mean, and unfortunately, it erases a lot of what was good about the game. The graphics just being, let's smooth out these pixel graphics, and I often find that to be a bit of a sort of ambiguous complaint in some degree. Sometimes, obviously, it's just down to a matter of taste. But in this case, they've just sort of smeared the definition of what the original sprites look like, and it doesn't work much less than how the music works as well, which sounds like a poor MIDI interpretation of the original tunes. In fact, that's almost exactly what I'd say it was, or someone attempting to recreate those tunes through a very, very simplified MIDI synthesizer of some sort.
That is unfortunate.
I think the suicide might still be in it though, so there's that, but no, there's literally nothing to recommend the PS2 port for, so
skip that one.
But a while after we got Assault Suit Valken, we got on the same platform Metal Warriors.
Yes, Metal Warriors is not a Messiah game. In fact, it's an American game that was developed by LucasArts. It plays quite similarly to Valken, and as both games were published in the States by Konami, there was a common misconception that Metal Warriors was its official sequel, rather than a send-up.
Easy to sort of understand when you look at some of the visual style though, because it looks very, very much a lot like a Japanese developed game. Again, the scaling of the sprites for the pilots in comparison to their mecha, very, very similar to what you had in Valken. I remember it seeming very purple, but that could just be me.
Yeah, it is quite purple. One of the odd things is there's no HUD. So you've got no the only way that you can the only way that the player can visualize how they're doing is how their mecha sprite changes when taking damage, which is an interesting idea, but I felt that it was maybe a little bit too little information.
Oh yeah, definitely. You get a particular like robot that you liked, and then the sense of attachment, I suppose, is a bit diminished when you don't know how you're doing, and like am I just gonna have to get out of this thing in a minute? Just because I've taken a bit of a hit. So yeah. Also, the different mecha in it were a lot more fanciful than what you'd get in the more military themed stuff. There was a spider looking.
Yeah, there was a spinning ball.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting, definitely interesting, and it's a fun game, but it doesn't have quite the same sort of serious tone to the same degree as something like Assault Suits Vulcan.
Yeah,
and I guess at the time found it more notable for how much it resembled or reminded me of Assault Suits Vulcan than anything else. Really.
It looks really good and it plays rather solidly, but I felt like there was something that just was maybe missing from the formula.
But
I'm not sure what.
Having a knockoff. Well, in some sense, it's not really a knockoff, but having something that pays homage in a lot of ways to a game that I really loved at the time was still not a bad thing. So yeah, and like you say, it plays well enough and has interesting designs, so it's definitely worth revisiting on the Super Nintendo.
Now the next game is quite a flagrant homage to Valken, and that is Squaresoft's front mission Gun Hazard. Once again directed by Hideo Suzuki. After directing Valken, he left Messiah and formed his own studio, Omiyasoft, teaming up with his pal Toshiro Tsuchida, who was not only a producer on Leynos, but went on to work with Square and create the Front Mission series. So these two gentlemen going off and trying to recreate their hit together.
And I mean, I think it really well from my opinion, really quite successful in getting that across. Sadly, never made available in English.
There is a very competent fan translation out there by Aeon Genesis that I encourage you to check out if you're into that sort of thing.
Oh, definitely.
This is essentially Valken RPG with character portraits by Yoshitaka Amano and an all-star soundtrack by Square's well-known composers, including Yasunori Mitsuda, Nobuo Uematsu, and Masashi Hamauzu, who went on to score many of the Final Fantasy games and Square's other RPGs.
Yeah, I mean, you can see, for instance, Suzuki's influence from having directed Valken, in that the way your mecha controls, some of the options you have in controlling it, the melee attack, and there's a block shield move, which again animates pretty much exactly as it did in Valken.
The game functions almost identically.
It's scaled down a little, I feel. There's the mecha seems sort of smaller on screen. There's a lot more real estate devoted to the HUD and some of those other on-screen elements.
Whereas Valken, not only were the character sprites big, but some of the bosses were gigantic and would fill the screen. Gun Hazard's bosses are rarely much bigger than the player, maybe double their size at most. I suppose that's just a preferential thing now.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and that extra real estate for the character portraits with the Amino art and a lot more dialogue it being based on front mission,
Mm-hmm.
and the RPG progression definitely makes it, it's a more extended experience. There's a lot more plot there.
It's a very, very, very long game.
Yeah, perhaps that's something that sadly I never got through it.
Mm-hmm.
I've played it from the beginning multiple times, never quite reaching the end. But
perhaps a little bit too long.
I think that may be its biggest flaw, which is not the worst flaw for a game to have. And it was certainly fun all the way that I got through. So.
Gun Hazard is a much more somber game than the games that we've talked about previously, whereas the Assault Suit games sort of touched upon the horrors of war as filtered through the excitement of Gundam. Gun Hazard is really trying to beat the player over the head with how bad war is, and it starts in the European country of Bergen with the soldier Albert trying to protect his president from a coup d'etat led by Colonel Hellbrand, who is a cartoon villain but quite vicious and horrifying. And ultimately, Albert fails in protecting the president and has to flee his country alongside a mercenary named Brenda. And he joins Brenda's merc team, and Albert and Brenda fly around the world, getting involved in numerous different conflicts, where we see rebels using nerve gas on villages of innocent people, and orphans throwing rocks at the robots that have killed their families, the whole thing is it's quite grim.
Yeah, it is, and I think maybe again that serves to sort of deaden the pace a little bit. Nothing again. There's as you say, there are grim moments in Valken, but maybe it almost feels like they're taking through a checklist of the horrors of war in this, which again, I guess Valken did, but because it did everything a bit more succinctly, it felt a bit more palatable in that way. I still think Gun Hazard is a wonderful game, and the sense of choice and the sense of being able to customize your mecha sort of play into the whole fantasy of the mecha pilot scenario again. And in some ways, that does that pulls off that fantasy a bit more successfully than Valken. But
it's a much different kind of story, but it is effective in what it sets out to do.
But I think almost though the customization sometimes becomes a little bit too much after a while. There's a bit too much management, and
you're constantly having to go back to shops to refuel and buy ammo, and there's so many different weapons that you can use, both main weapons and sub weapons, and you need to make sure you've got ammo for your sub weapons. It can be very fiddly if you want it to. Sometimes that becomes a necessity, and that may be a time when the pace starts to die a bit.
I think maybe some of that comes from the result of welding these two particular games together, Front Mission and Valken, because I actually quite enjoyed the first Front Mission game, which I even replayed on its DS re-release, and those systems work fine in a pretty simple tactical RPG, but when they're attached to they sort of almost serve to make some of the gameplay, the action gameplay, have a little bit less impact somehow. And you spend a lot of time wandering around fighting enemies that in some cases seem a bit insignificant, so it lessens the impact of the individual fights.
There's an aspect of RPG style grinding there too. So I mean, oftentimes you'll go into a stage which has no goal other than get to the other side, and you'll have to kill these inconsequential mechs for experience to increase the hit points of your mech suit. And those things they feel a little bit at odds with the core gameplay. So it's questionable exactly how well the RPG aspects work, but on the whole, it's a pretty good experience.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's comes highly recommended. I think that adding RPG aspects to this sort of game definitely brings something to it. I think there's just perhaps something to be said for not adding too much of the grind and possibly going overboard with that kind of stat customization in a side-scrolling platformer. I mean, in something like Armored Core, maybe that's a different thing, but we're not talking about Armored Core. So, yes, indeed. Still a highly commendable game, definitely worth checking out. Working in a lot of the same ways that Valken does. But
no, the controls are second to none.
No,
it feels really great.
Well, it feels a lot like Valken, which is that it's. I think it's more the structure of the game that it's placed in that perhaps sometimes lets it down.
Okay, we're going to take a little break, and we'll be right back. So we're skipping ahead a number of years here to 2010, when the mecha platformer genre seemed all but dead. A Dojin group called Astroport burst onto the scene with their game Gigantic Army, which is available on Steam.
And it's definitely got a lot of the hallmarks of Suzuki's games in it.
Gigantic Army controls very similarly to the Assault Suits games. Maybe not quite as tight mechanically.
There's a bit of a lighter, sort of more fast-moving feel to the mecha, I think, slightly compared to Valken.
It's interesting.
Perhaps.
It's interesting that you say that. I actually found the mecha controls in Gigantic Army to feel slightly sluggish and slow-paced, which I felt was at odds with the game's other themes, in that it feels very, very sort of arcade-based. You have a choice of weapon at the beginning of the game, but that's not something that you can switch out later. What you choose at the beginning is what you're stuck with.
It's like a Gradius weapon or something.
You have a limited number of continues, and I don't think the game saves, so it's meant to be played in one sitting.
There's you can get through the entire game in, I think, half an hour if you one credit it.
Yeah,
but,
it's very, very short.
But I mean, it's also got a time limit, which again contributes to the arcade feel. Although I felt that the time limit was somehow making up for the fact that you've got a very, very effective shield that would, well, if not for the time limit, which is fairly restrictive. I think it's like 2 minutes a level, 3 minutes a level, or something like that. Or in some levels it varies, I think. But you can sort of turtle up behind the shield quite easily, if not for the fact that you're forced to press on because of this time limit. So I mean, it's definitely, well, despite feelings about how it controls, it's very fluid. It runs at a pretty high frame rate, so that makes it stand out compared to the old 16-bit titles. But
it looks pretty good.
Yeah.
The bosses live up to the name. They are positively gigantic.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt that a lot of the enemies looked a lot like the bad guys out of Macross.
Okay.
To me, they had a sort of mechanical yet slightly organically formed sort of feel to them.
Okay. I hadn't made that connection, but it really reminded me a lot of some coin-op games. The sort of giant spider mechs reminded me of things like Aero Fighters or Gradius.
I can definitely see that.
Yeah, or even Metal Slug.
But I don't recall, there is a little bit of text here and there defining the plot. Not that it's vital to the game, but I believe the enemies are the not very well detailed Ramulons or something.
Yes, not the Romulans, but the Ramulans.
Yes.
Gigantic Army tells its story in a very odd way, in that it's quite plot light, but each level is punctuated by a wall of text that takes the form of the player characters' journal entries. And to me, it just felt like a lot of words to say, not very much.
Mm.
But Gigantic Army, it feels like quite a lonely game, whereas in all of the previous games that we've touched on, you're constantly being radioed by your teammates or home base, or even sometimes your enemy combatants. Whereas Gigantic Army, it's you against the aliens with your trusty journal at hand.
I think it's very much so like, the atmosphere for me, aside from the points we've touched on, seems to be mostly defined by how much it takes from Assault Suit Valken more than anything. I think. I mean, there's very distinct. So again, some of the mechanics distinctly resemble that. The way the shield is used, the power up icons look, like very much like just a high res version of the old Valken icons. There are those levels with the gun emplacements, which I think become both of the modern games that call on Valken have the exact same sort of enemy in them.
Yeah, they do.
Which I guess they were fun to fight in Valken, so yay for bringing them back, I guess. But
I guess so.
Yeah, but there's not much. Ultimately, Gigantic Army is fun for being a modern throwback to what Valken presented, but it feels like it's such a deliberate calling back to those games that it lacks a bit of character of its own.
I mean, I was surprised and impressed the first time I played it, just how similar it was to Valken. But once I got over that initial surprise, I felt a little bit lukewarm towards it.
I mean, the boss battles again. I hate to use the word generic so much, but I mean they're cool in terms of design. They're being a large enemy, but they're not dissimilar from bosses you'd see in a side-scrolling shooter of other types, for instance. I mean, there's that. It often comes down to just being an exercise in wading through bullet patterns instead of engaging with something that has more of a sense of character. I guess.
It's very tropey in its mechanics. It's very much it wishes to be a callback, and it's satisfied with being that and nothing, and not bringing anything new to the table.
And I think it's probably, if anything, that highlights what makes the games in this genre work. Is that balance between because the gameplay of Gigantic Army is balanced and plays just fine. It's kind of hard to fault really in any of those ways, but again, it just sort of like lacks the character of what it's representing, and that's not certainly not the crime in terms of making a fun side-scrolling 2D game, but doesn't really succeed on what you might want from a game of this type. So
sure.
So any more we can say on Gigantic Army? Really?
I think we've said it all, really.
Yeah. Well, so then we'll come on to Gunhound.
This is a game that you told me about that I was not aware of previously, and I really, really like this one.
Yeah, no, it's a pretty successful callback to the games in this genre for sure.
Gunhound happens to be even more arcadey than Gigantic Army, but I feel that it works in this instance. Your mech is a lot speedier, but it doesn't sacrifice the weightiness. You still, the agility doesn't hamper the simulation.
You're definitely right there. I mean, there's the way the boost works is quite effective. Although I do feel that there's quite an involved tutorial instructing you on some movement mechanics that are kind of tricky to pull off the first time around.
Oh yeah, I sort of viewed the tutorial as a series of bonus challenges, maybe like the Metal Gear VR missions.
That's probably a better way to view them.
They
Because,
require a lot more technique than the main game does.
which was sort of like a little bit disappointing in a way, because I thought, okay, this game's going to offer these like interesting movement challenges, but then it didn't actually. So. But no, that the tutorial stuff was quite involved and satisfying. It's just, again, maybe given the circumstances of development, those were things that they never got to quite implement in the level design, perhaps.
I felt that the mechanics were not at odds with the arcadey nature. Once again, we see continues and a time limit, but the continues are unlimited, and they just cost you your score, and therefore, I suppose, your pride. You can quit and walk away at any time, and the game will save your progress. At the beginning of each stage, of course. But
I think you're right there with the arcade nature of the levels. It means that they can be these cut down experiences. Well, not cut down as in extremely short or anything, but each one usually is a particular type of scenario. One of them, for instance, like has you sliding down the side of a mountain.
Boosting
them. It's like
kind of on skis.
which was pretty cool.
It's great.
Yeah, and I think that bit got a little bit frustrating and repetitive in the middle of it, but still, like the variety in those different scenarios makes it a lot of fun. And
it really has a thing for spectacle. It's bright and colorful. The bosses are gigantic and ridiculous. The music is loud and pumping.
Yeah.
And
there's the character dialogue, which was missing from Gigantic Army. That's got there.
Out of all the games we've talked about, this is the only one that features a female protagonist. Although she's sort of a typical anime heroine.
She doesn't like the fact that everyone thinks she's young or something.
Yeah. But I mean, every character in this game looks like they're about 10 years old.
It sounds there's a little bit of awkward fan service on the loading screens.
There is, isn't there? There's a few panty shots.
Yeah, and there's an attempt at a pseudo-political plot, no blood for neutron polymer, or something. But
I feel it's, in terms of plot, I mean, I appreciated that you were communicating with your squad. But I don't feel like it was as interesting as the games that preceded it, especially Valken.
No, not at all. I think there's just sort of a bit too much of pointless seeming character stuff that doesn't really go anywhere. I do recall the main villain having some kind of like Darwinist idea about hate driving the human race, but even that was just like, felt like it was a throwaway line that didn't really contribute to anything. So it's just these little disjointed asides that don't really add up to much.
It's very 2010s anime.
I guess that's why I haven't watched any anime in 2010. But yeah. But no, the mechanics, the pixelated nature of the graphics, it's done at a much lower res than the Gigantic Army, and I feel it comes off sort of better for it in some ways because there's more character there.
Some of the smaller sprites don't look so hot. The soldiers who aren't in suits running in the field, or the helicopters, don't look great, but I feel that the mechs have loads of frames of animation and just look fantastic.
Yeah.
They move very fluidly. As I said, some of the bosses are gigantic and ridiculous. There's a giant mechanical worm that rises out of the sea.
Oh yeah, and you shoot its underside.
It attacks you like a whip.
Yeah, well, it's those sorts of things that call back to why the genre succeeded in the ways it did in the 16-bit era. It's these segmented sprites that give a sense of machinery, really.
Yeah.
That's something that works, I think. Things like the giant worm, or just the arms of your robot moving separately from its body.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't sound like much, but in that sort of simplified 2D play, it sort of like adds to this mechanical feeling.
Yeah. One of the bosses is it's a fighter jet with legs.
That was very, very Macross.
Yeah.
In fact, when it first appeared on screen, I did for a moment think, have you just scanned and digitized something from Macross? But yeah, it was still a cool, well done pixel art. Although one of the more bullet hell bosses in the game.
It was very bullet hell.
Yeah.
It took me a few tries, and I felt a little bit frustrated at the end of it. But I really liked Gunhound's ridiculous bosses, which just brought to mind an earlier era of spectacle in games where your giant boss character doesn't have to make sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But if it was a tank that had a helicopter attached or something, then that was good enough.
Yeah. it really it tapped into a certain nostalgia for me that I appreciated.
And I think it's a nostalgia that they were aiming to tap, and well done on them for succeeding in that way. I mean, the only things I ever found slightly disappointing were it hewing so close to what Valken was, were its differences, again, those wonderful turrets that everyone likes to shoot, but the levels not being as expansive as they were in Valken. But it, like you said, with the arcadey nature of the game, it doesn't quite aim for the same sort of pacing. So that's sort of all right. And the variety of scenarios made up for that. I think that there's the one stage you're defending a boat on the stage. You know, it's just you're fighting through a jungle. There's a great sense of like different situations you're put into.
There's even a sort of, dare I say, a sort of Street Fighter kind of bonus stage where you have to destroy a bunch of helicopters before time runs out.
Oh yeah.
When it was strong, it was strong. Although it may not have been as ambitious as its predecessors, it's a fun little diversion.
Oh, definitely, and nice to be reminded again that there was an attempt to create that sort of feel and genre in the 2D plane.
Yeah,
and which is why we should be looking forward to the next project from Dracue, which is their remake of Assault Suits Leynos.
Yes, so Dracue are remaking Leynos for the PlayStation 4.
I've heard about this for I think a couple of years now, so I've been quite excited to hear what this might, the prospect of this might be.
So I guess this was announced around the PlayStation 4's launch, and there hasn't really been much more information since then.
There was one video that looked just a bit like an up-resed version of the first stage of Leynos.
Yeah, a demo was released over the summer on Japanese PSN.
Oh, I haven't seen this.
I downloaded it and I played a little bit of it today. It includes the first 3 stages of the game. So like half the game? Yeah, I'm not sure what else they're going to if they're going to expand the game or not, because Leynos is only 8 stages long, so 3 stages is quite a hefty chunk. It's Leynos. It's the same mission structure, but with updated controls and mechanics to feel more like Valken. I gotta say, it controls fine, and if any of the Assault Suit games deserved a remake, it's probably the first Leynos. But I'm wondering if it's really necessary.
I mean, if it plays fairly close to Leynos, I don't know if there's that much to be gained from remaking it.
It's extremely faithful to its source material. I mean, aside from the updated controls and visuals and music.
So what did the controls add to?
Well, it plays more like Valken than Leynos. Right. So
that's definitely an improvement.
Yeah, so you've got a much more easy to understand and fun to play control scheme, which reduces a lot of the frustration of the original game. But it seems like it's going to adhere quite closely.
Well, I guess they've got the position of bringing that game to a new group of people who've not played the original, because apart from there is emulation, but beyond emulation and people who don't necessarily want to emulate stuff on the PC for lots of valid reasons, there's the only other way you can play Leynos is by getting a cartridge and a Mega Drive, and I suppose this is a more palatable option for some in some ways.
I suppose if anybody is going to remake Leynos, I mean, Dracue have proved themselves with Gunhound, so they're probably the most appropriate team. But yeah, it seems like they're doing a commendable job. But I'm not sure exactly how interested I am in returning to it.
I think my interest in this case is kind of academic due to my love of the genre, so I'd probably give it a try. But I can't say that I'm expecting it to completely excite me or anything like that.
It's kind of neat to hear the Farty Mega Drive soundtrack updated to sort of a heavy metal rendition in the same way as Gunhound.
So does it sound like Dynasty Warriors then?
Slightly, yeah. That's actually an apt comparison.
Right.
It doesn't sound terrible.
Okay, I guess that sounds like a fun possibility. But I mean, I suppose a better way to experience these games in the current era is, I believe that Cybernator, the US release of Assault Suits Valken, is available on one of the virtual consoles.
Okay. Yeah, I believe you're
That's
right.
the Wii or the Wii U.
Either way,
Yeah.
that's a place to look for it.
Yeah, and it is definitely. I mean, even in its American incarnation, it's a game that's well worth experiencing, and plays really well even now. So and possibly hasn't been bettered in what it represents. So I'd say it's definitely something that's worthy. That's definitely of interest.
Yeah, track it down on Virtual Console if you can. Throw Messiah a few bucks.
Are they even around anymore?
They are back in a limited capacity. I don't think they have any studios of their own. They're farming out their franchises to other companies. Dracue is of course doing Leynos. I think they've got another team doing a new Langrisser title. I think they're just using third parties and publishing now. So that's Assault Suits and its legacy. Really, it's easy to see just how deep an impact these games had on the genre. And although it's not a genre that's really around so much anymore, when modern development studios choose to call back to the genre, the influence of Assault Suits is plainly visible.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think even just sort of like witnessing this particular era and portion of games highlights some of what it takes and how to execute on the idea of bringing the atmospheric tone and feel of a particular kind of like sci-fi genre into games through mechanics and through the art assets that were available at the time, and that's definitely something that's fascinating to observe.
Okay, well, I think that's where we'll wrap up. And thanks very much for listening, and
thank you for listening.
We'll catch you next time.